Weirdboy.
Hello everybody, my name is Eric, and in today's video, we are going to be painting the Weirdboy. Yes, that's right, the original, pewter, mid-2000s Weirdboy by Games Workshop, and not one of those damn conversions. To get the paint right where I wanted it, I used Winsor & Newton Series 7 brushes sizes 1 and 2 for this project, as well as some other brushes just lying around for the less detailed work. As far as the color scheme I wanted for this model, I took inspiration from the studio model, but wanted to add my own unique touch to it. I'll be painting this model to be a part of the Goth clan, so the vest will be black. I also intend to paint a unique freehand on the edges of the vest and on the staff, as opposed to the checker pattern that is on the studio model. I know many of my other models have the checker pattern, but I figure since this is a Weirdboy, he should be different. Alright, without further ado, let's get this party started. I first assembled this model several years ago, so unfortunately I don't have any footage of assembly. So let's focus on the painting. After priming the model black, I took Abaddon Black and painted a thin coat over any areas where the primer missed and over any areas that will be painted black, like the vest, the Gretchen's boots, and the gloves. After the black has been established, the first thing I like to paint on the model is the base. I wanted this model to fit in with the rest of my army, which has a desert theme, so I started with a base coat of Deathclaw Brown. This was followed by a liberal overbrush of Zandri Dust. Ushabti Bone was lightly dry brushed to finish the sand on the base. I find that this mix of colors gives a nice desert effect, with nice shading but still feeling like desert. Alright, as with all the other orcs I've painted, I like to start with the skin. I take a big brush and slap a thin coat of Waagh Flesh all over the skin, not being concerned about the neatness at this stage, as I'll be cleaning up any mistakes later. This was applied in several thin coats. With the same brush, I apply Warboss Green over the skin on the Ork and the Gretchen, covering all of the previous coats of Waagh Flesh. The previous color was solely intended as a base coat. Next, I took a much smaller brush, but not the Winsor & Newton's, and started to wash Biel Tan Green all over the skin, taking care to cover every area in one go so as to avoid any tide marks. After this had thoroughly dried, I took Biel Tan Green again and applied it only in the deepest recesses, so places like in between the fingers, under the lip, around the knuckles. This helps to add even more shading and create a nice spectrum of shading on the model, some of it subtle, and some much more intense in the deepest areas of shadow. I find it never looks great when every part of a model has the same level of shading. Really subtle crevices should have really subtle shading, and really deep craters should have the most intense shading. After this dries, I then apply yet another pass of Biel Tan Green to get even more definition in the deepest recesses. After all the wash had dried, I take my Winsor & Newton Series Size 2 and Warboss Green again and reapply it to all the skin, being super careful to avoid painting over the shading I had just applied. I do this because the first layer of wash darkens everything it touches, at least to some degree. By reapplying the base coat, I am re-establishing the core color I want the skin to be. Next, I take a 50-50 mix of Warboss Green and Skarsnik Green and apply it as a highlight to all of the edges of the skin. So this would include the ridges of the Weirdboy's face, veins, knuckles, edges of muscles, and the noses of the Gretchen. This is a somewhat subtle highlight, and I wanted to apply several more, so I kept the strokes fairly broad so as to have room to place the upcoming highlights while having the first one visible. Next, I took pure Skarsnik Green
and with the size 1 Winsor & Newton brush, apply to the sharper edges, being sure to leave the previous highlight visible. I also try to mix up the stroke of the highlight, so it isn't perfectly uniform across whatever edge I'm painting over. I like to have the stroke get thicker towards the sharper edges and become a little thinner towards the more subtle edges. As a final highlight for the skin, I took Craig Khaki and applied tiny little dots and lines on the sharpest corners and edges of the skin, mainly on the face of the Weirdboy. To add some variety and interest to the model, I took Biel Red, and with only a small amount on my brush, I glazed over the lips, noses, and knuckles of the Weirdboy and the Gretchen. I find that this red helps to add a wonderful pop of contrast to the mini. I follow this up by taking some Caledor Sky, or any blue you happen to have on hand, and mix it with a hefty serving of Lamian Medium. That is then glazed over the lower eyelids. This adds even more contrast to the face, which is a major focal point of the model. After this stage, the skin is done. Next up, the brains and the nails of the Weirdboy. I started off with a base coat of Khorne Red. This was then followed up with a highlight of Khorne Red and Dwarf Flesh. This was followed up by adding even more Dwarf Flesh, only to discover that the brain looked dumb, so I started over. This time with the base coat of Khorne Red and Screaming Skull, in a roughly 3-to-1 mix, Khorne Red to Screaming Skull. The brain was then shaded with Biel Red. The original mix of Khorne Red and Screaming Skull was then reapplied to the brain, being careful not to paint over the shading that was already applied. I then took Screaming Skull and added it to the Khorne Red mix for the first chunky highlight. I kept adding more Screaming Skull for yet another highlight on the sharper edges. This mix was also applied to the nails. The lighter colors applied to the part of the nails furthest from the toes and fingers. This was done to create a gemstone effect, like the studio model has. For the next step, I take some white scar and paint it on the darkest and lightest parts of the nails to imply a gemstone effect. Oh man. That is so satisfying. The contrast really makes it pop. Alright, with the skin done, it is time to tidy up any green that has gotten onto the black. I now take Abaddon Black and repaint any area of the vest, boots, gloves, and tire that have gotten paint on them. With some cleanup done, the next phase of painting the model is to apply the base coats to every part of the model that is not the skin. I will start with the cape of the Weirdboy, because that is the deepest part of the model, and if I make any mistake in this part, I will be painting the rest of the model's base coats and can paint over any mistakes made. The cape and the fur on the loincloth were painted with the base coat of Mournfang Brown. This was applied in not one, but 2 thin coats. Moving along. I paint Dwarf Flesh onto the loincloth areas that are not the fur. I know that Dwarf Flesh isn't made anymore, but really any flesh tone will work. It is just what I had available. Again, thin coats. For the next base coat, I took Rhinox Hide and applied it to the teeth, belts, and string. Following this, I took Steel Legion Drab and painted the pants of the Gretchen, 2 thin coats again. After this was done, I took Skavenblight Dinge and painted the shirts of the Gretchen. Next color is Zandri Dust. This was used to base coat the straps, the bones, and the teeth of the Gretchen. Be prepared for this to take more than 2 thin coats. After the Zandri Dust, I applied Ushabti Bone to the bone and skull areas. So, just be sure to thin that paint. Thin that paint. Seriously, thin it down with water. Lots. And lots of water. You want many, many thin coats. Karak Stone was then applied to all of the straps on the arms and legs. Baneblade Brown was layered onto the Eldar rune over the Weirdboy's chest. Next, Skavenblight Dinge was painted onto the straps on the staff for contrast with the lightness and warmth of the bone. Mephiston Red was painted onto the cables on the staff and on the eyes. Next up, the tongues. I started with a mix of Khorne Red and Caledor Sky in approximately 50-50 ratio, and then applied it to the tongues of the Weirdboy and the Gretchen on his side. Fenrisian Grey was then added to the previous mix in about a 3-to-1 ratio. I took care to make the highlight a bit chunky. I then added even more Fenrisian Grey to the mix. I'm not sure what the exact ratio is, but I try to add enough to make it noticeable. Moving right along. Next step is to take Ceramite White, or really any white color, and apply it to the handle of the staff. I kept the paint very thin so as not to make it too thick, because this took a whole hell of a lot of coats. With the white of the staff done, it's time to paint the metallics, and to start this off, I took a brush that was not my Winsor & Newton's and applied lead belcher in several thin coats to everything that is metallic. All of the metal panels and icons, the coils, the orbs on the staff, the fronts of the Gretchen boots, the brass teeth, and all of the chains. And there's a lot of chains. Next step was to paint brass scorpion over any metallic areas that were to be brass, like the bells, the center stripe on the chains on the back, the orbs on the staff, and the brass teeth, of course. For the next step, I took Gehenna's gold and applied it to the aquila on the chest of the orc and on the halo on top of the staff. And that marks the end of all of the base coats. For the next phase, I then shaded the areas I base coated, starting off with Nuln Oil, which was applied liberally to the metallics, except for the gold areas. Nuln Oil was then applied to just the recesses on the brace of the arm and the dark brown leather sections. Nuln Oil was also applied in the recesses of the dark gray shirts and all over the straps on the staff. After the Nuln Oil had dried, I applied Agrax Earthshade to the deeper recesses on the skulls, bones, pants of the Gretchen, wrappings, the eyes, the cape on the back, and I gave an all-over shade on the gold halo, elder icon, and the loincloth. With the cape, I stippled Agrax Earthshade on the fringes of the cloth towards the bottom to suggest wear and tear. This was done in sequential layers. Alright, with the shading done, the next step I did was to take Zandri Dust and apply it in thin lines to the Weirdboy's tooth and the fastening threads on the Gretchen's clothes. Ushabti Bone was reapplied to the bone areas to tidy them up and create a clean, crisp look. Next, I took Karak Stone and reapplied it to all of the straps that were washed with Agrax Earthshade. I find that doing this really emphasizes the contrast and makes the area pop. To highlight all the bones, teeth, and straps, I carefully applied Screaming Skull to the edges. Moving right along, I then took Dwarf Flesh and applied it to the loincloth. Gotta reestablish that base coat, leaving the shading in the recesses, of course. I then took Dwarf Flesh and mixed it with Screaming Skull in about a 50-50 mix and applied it to the edges of the loincloth. Right, Eldar Rune time. I reapplied the base coat of the Baneblade Brown, leaving the wash in the recesses. Screaming Skull was mixed with Baneblade Brown as the first chunky highlight. Next, I apply more Screaming Skull to the mix and go to town with that edge highlight, doing my best to keep the chunky highlight still visible. Sorry if I don't know the exact ratios in the mixes. I just try to make sure the mix color is noticeably visible to the eye once applied. Finally, the last highlight of pure Screaming Skull was applied to the sharpest edges and points of the icon. Goblin Pants. Let's finish him. I took Steel Legion Drab and Screaming Skull in about a 2-to-1 mix and applied it as a fairly chunky highlight. I then added even more Screaming Skull and applied it as a fine edge highlight to the sharper edges. Noticing a pattern here? Moving right along, Mournfang Brown was applied to the cape to clean up any wash that got out of hand. Scrag Brown was applied as a chunky highlight. I painted the edges of the cape, but also painted thin lines in alternating directions near the bottom of the cape to imply a cloth texture, with some wear and tear on it. Deathclaw Brown was applied as the final highlight. I was careful to make even thinner lines and paint more lines on the cape to imply texture. The next step was to apply Wild Rider Red to the cables on the staff and the centers of the red eyes. I then took Fire Dragon Bright, held my breath, and applied a spiral pattern to the bulging eye of the orc, as well as making tiny little dots on the Gretchen. The process of painting the spiral was super hard to capture on my camera, so I will illustrate on my computer. So it was really hard to record the footage of me painting the spiral on the eye, so I thought I'd show you in Photoshop. So here's a picture of the model and the eye just painted red, and what I'm looking to do is to paint a very small spiral of Fire Dragon Bright in the eye, just like this. Now I use the size 1 Winsor & Newton, but any small brush should do, and a good bit of patience. Doombull Brown was applied as the chunky highlight to the arm leather and the belts. This was followed up by Tuskgor Fur as a sharper edge highlight, being sure to apply some random thin lines to imply a leathery texture along the edges. Next up, tire time. I took Skavenblight Dinge and painted a chunky highlight along all of the edges of the ridges. It took less time than I thought. I followed this up with a crisp edge highlight of Stormvermin Fur. This color was also used to highlight the straps on the staff and the shirts on the Gretchen. The straps and the shirts on the Gretchen were then finished off with a second highlight of Stormvermin Fur mixed in with an equal part of Ushabti Bone. With most of the highlights done now, I then started to paint a spiral pattern onto the handle of the staff with Abaddon Black. I wanted to carry out the spiral motif going on with the eye, and it just felt more dynamic than the checker pattern. I started by placing diagonal marks on the staff. I then added to the lines around the staff, meeting the next diagonal line. It took a bit of patience, but was much easier than I thought it would be. The black was also painted over the gemstones to get them ready for later. Time to highlight the black areas. This was started off with Eshin Grey, applied to the vest, boots, and the power pack of the staff. This was then followed up by a crisp edge highlight of Dawnstone. Okay, time for the gemstones. I started the one on the left with a coat of Mephiston red on almost all the gemstone except for the very top. Evil Sun's Scarlet was applied in the same fashion, but with the Mephiston red showing. Next was Wild Rider red, applied in a crest along the lower portion of the gemstone. Troll Slayer orange was applied next in an even finer crest pattern. Finally, a small line of Fire Dragon Bright was applied to the bottom of the left gemstone. The red cables on the staff were also highlighted at this time, with Wild Rider red. The eye of the skull on the staff was painted as well with Fire Dragon Bright. The gemstone on the right was painted with Caledor Sky, Teclis blue, and then Lothern blue. This was painted in the same style as the red gemstone. Man, I sure am spending a lot of time on really tiny details. Time to highlight the metallic areas. This was done with Mithril Silver and a small brush, but not the Winsor & Newtons again. I painted fine lines on the edges of the silver, brass, and gold areas. I used the edge of my brush when applicable and painted tiny scratches to imply nicks and scratches. I thought about highlighting every single chain link individually, but you just don't get the time back, man. You just never get it back. Never get it back. Alright, so this is what I am thinking. So for this, for my Weird Boy, I don't want to go with a little checker pattern on the fringes of his vest, like the studio model. I want, so I don't want this. I was thinking something like a flame pattern on the edges of the vest, of the sleeves. I think that just matches with the spirally kind of motif going on, and I think it just fits like the psychic nature of the character better. So, and I want to make mine a little more distinct, so this is what I'm going for. And the way I'm gonna paint these little flames on the edges of the vest is I'm going to start out with a little guideline in white over the black tunic or vest, and then I'm going to paint little scribbles or little kind of half circle lines kind of leading up to the top of the line, the guideline here, just like this. There we go. And you can mix up the sizes of the lines, just like this. I think it'll look better if they're not all the same length. You just add some variety, it'll really spice it up. There we go. So something like this around the edges of the tunic or the vest. So a little diagram of his torso. So here's his vest. I'm not going to include his head just for this little diagram. So I'm going to be adding these little wavy flame patterns all across the portion that goes over his arm. Just like that. Great, but before I paint the vest, I will use white scar to paint the little highlights on the gemstones. So very satisfying. Next, I take Ulthuan Grey and paint small lines on the edges of the vest to indicate where I want the flame patterns to go. I then started to paint wavy lines that met at the top of the guideline before filling in the outline with thin paint. As I started painting the flames on either side of the vest, I realized I probably didn't need to paint the guidelines. But live and learn. The paint was super thin, so it took about 3 coats to get good coverage I was happy with. I then took white scar and highlighted the very edges of the flames on the vest, and took Ceramite White and tidied up the spirals on the staff. Once this was finished, I realized that the flames looked uneven, so I took Abaddon Black and trimmed some of the bigger flames. And last, but not least, I painted the rim of the base with Steel Legion Drab, aka the right way to paint the base. Please be nice in the comments. And it's finally done. This model took a minute to finish, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. I like how the flames really add a more dynamic energy to the mini, and they frame the head quite well. The spirals on the staff are a nice variation to the checker pattern, while still feeling familiar. Well, I just wanted to say I had a great time making this video, and I hope you learned a thing or two along the way. This would be the part of the video where I'd say to paint your favorite mini, or even to paint your favorite army, but at the end of the day, there's just too many models.